seem to like xAPI dude, so I'll be xAPI dude at my domain. Okay, so now it's taken me into Captivate, and if you look at the link up here, all it really did is that mailbox that I put in, and it appended it to the end of the link. So now you could send that link off to a user, and it would automatically identify that, that particular actor. Or if you're hosting this on an LMS, it will actually look in the SCORM object, say, does the SCORM object contain an actor? If it does, then uses the same philosophy. So it looks first for SCORM, it looks second for something in the link. If neither of those two conditions exist, then it will pop up that email screen so that we're able to capture the actor. So just to get started here, I wanted to kind of talk about why this project came to be, you know, how we think about it, all of that sort of stuff. So really this project Catalyst became one of the tools that we use where I work. It's an app that is capable of playing like Captivate content, HTML content. And we had a new use case, and all of a sudden we had a much heavier consumption of Captivate authored content than we had before. And we already had a xAPI-centric culture, or our app was already all built around xAPI. So we said, okay, it's great. We know that we're accessing this piece through xAPI, but we don't know what happens once the user gets inside of it. So the whole thought was, how can we capture what's happening once they actually get inside of the content and make it mesh up with the rest of our ecosystem? So a couple of requirements that I put around that was eliminate the need to have to write custom code for each published package, because that's what I found myself doing. I publish it, and then depending on what the scope was and what we wanted to know, I was spending anywhere from 1, and I think my biggest project was like 6 hours worth of coding just so I could get the data out of this one project. And I said, well, certainly there's got to be a way to unify this, or make it more uniform, so I can just apply a package to everything, and the code is already done, the heavy lifting is done, I adjust a few parameters, and off I go. Another requirement that I had was I really wanted to use a robust xAPI profile, because we do a lot of LRS reporting. So if you don't have things in there like contact activities like your parents and things like that, it can be really hard to look at, you know, 1,000 different activities that are coming out of a course. So it needed to contain the right context. It needed to have, you know, as much data as we could so that we could sort that out in the LRS and really get some value out of what's coming back in. And then the third requirement is I'm not surrounded by coders. You know, I've got some instructional designers on my team, and most of the time I think they want me to slow down. And so I wanted to make something very easy that really anybody with a little bit of a walkthrough could be taught how to do. And eventually the final state of this will be you don't have to do any coding. You don't have to do any custom stuff. You just point to your Captivate package and it'll install everything for you. We're not to that point yet, but that's kind of where the end is. But I think once you've been through the process a couple of times, really this can be done in about 4 minutes is what it takes to set up any Captivate publish package you have with this wrapper. So a little bit of jargon that I'm going to use as I'm walking through and explaining it, and I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So Captivate is an e-learning authoring tool from Adobe, and this package that we're looking at right now was created in Captivate. So this is a Captivate course basically that we created. What Captivate does is you create your course, and really all it's doing is turning it into the language of the web, right? So it spits out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Again, don't want to get too codey, but just think about it this way. HTML is what's on the page, CSS is how it looks on the page, and JavaScript is just how it acts on the page. So if I click this button and now this box pops up, that's JavaScript that's making it happen. Another thing, the name of the project here is Team Captivate JavaScript Library. So a library is just a collection of code that coexists with other code. We make these libraries available to coders, and it does all the heavy lifting. I mean, could someone else build this? Sure they could, but then you'd have to go through all the testing, all the stuff, doing it from scratch, where in a lot of cases these libraries are pre-built for you. It's been vetted, and that was really what the vision was for this library, was you've got a vetted JavaScript library, you couple with Captivate, and now you're getting some great xAPI. Another thing I'm going to talk about is how this came together. So Captivate has something called APIs, and really all they are is a set of predefined ways to use JavaScript to ask things of the Captivate publish package, like who is my user, what slide are they on, how many seconds have they been on the slide, on and on and on. There's a lot of different variables that you can ask Captivate to give you the value of, and that's really how all of these statements are built, is it's using that those Captivate APIs and pulling all of the information from there. So you just build like you normally do and set a few properties, and they're properties that you would set anyways, and now these APIs are pulling them in, and that's what's creating your xAPI statement. Another thing that I'll talk about a little bit, or you might hear me reference or see in the code or different places, is super wrapper, and that's just kind of a name I coined for this, because really my ultimate goal here is once I finish Captivate, I would like to go do this for other different pieces that are out there. Build connectors that, you know, without being as geek-free as possible, that you can capture some really rich data, and it just listens to what's happening. You know, that's really how a lot of this works. Even on, you know, a lot of this comes out of the Captivate APIs, but there were some things that the Captivate APIs don't tell you how to do. For instance, video. There's really no good interface for video, at least that I could find in Captivate. So I actually just used, and all they're using is HTML video. So I figured out how to parse all of that information to get out the information like scrubbed and all of those different things that I'll demonstrate here in a little bit. So that all came out of kind of that super wrapper type concept or model. Okay, so let's get into some interesting stuff. Let's get into a demo here and see this thing in action. So this has been listening to this package the entire time, but let's jump off to this slide. So here's the verbs that I use, and actually I'm at the Torrance Learning thing here live, and I just learned all about profiles, and I don't know that I used the SCORM profile for e-learning, and I'm going to have to go back. I can't wait to get home now and apply all that I've learned today at the cohort. So it's been great. But just for this example, you'll see that for navigation, the verbs that we're really using are accessed, entered, viewed, returned, focused, and unfocused. Those are just the verbs I chose, and I'll kind of show you how that works. So let me jump off here. So this slide is titled Navigation Verb Explanation. In the properties in Captivate, when I had to give this slide a name, that's what I called it, was Navigation Verb Explanation. Now why is that important? Why is this countdown happening? Because I wanted to hit the next button right at 15 seconds. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to go into Watershed, refresh the statements, and, sorry for a second. Okay, so remember I said the name of the slide was Navigation Verb Explanation, and all I did was put that in the properties of Captivate. Now that becomes my activity. It assigns an ID to it. It does all of that heavy lifting for you. All you had to do was name your slide, and now that becomes the activity. Now, without trying to get too, you know, brackets and commas and all that good stuff, you can see here, remember how I wanted to wait 15 seconds, and it looks like I delayed 1 second because the actual duration that we spent on that slide was 16 seconds. So you may notice that there's two different verbs here referring to this navigation verb explanation. There's entered slide. Well, entered slide, all that's saying is that I'm entered that slide. I don't know how long the user was on it, what they did on it. I just know that they got to that point. But I may want to know how long they've spent on that slide. Did they progress from there? And so then that's why this one now turns into viewed slide. Now it's past tense, and now we've got more information around that. Another thing that's in there too, when I talked about having robust xAPI, is you can see it's putting in a parent here. So every single one of these sub-slide activities is going to have a parent with it. Now why is that important? Well, once I get to the LRS, I could say I want to know the information for this slide, I want to know information for this slide, and I can put in all 30 slides that I want to know about individually, but that's very time consuming. Instead, I can say, just give me every activity that has the verb viewed that has this parent, and every activity in my LRS is now going to show. So it's a way, from a reporting standpoint, you can very quickly aggregate the data and not have to poke around or spend so much time building different reports. Another thing that I embedded into each one is these extensions here. And I still don't know if this is quite the right format, but for instance, this one shows you the slide index that you're on. It gives you the slide name, so we're looking at the view demo slide, which you can also find in the activity. But the one that I think is kind of neat is how did they get there? These were all of the slides that they went through prior until they got to this slide. So not really too exciting for linear learning, but what if you're doing branching learning and you want to know where do your users go? What do they look at first? What do they look at second? What order do they follow when they're going through the learning? This is a way that you can kind of look at the path that they're on and be able to establish what they're doing. So another one, let's go back here. Actually, let's switch over now to some reporting. So, yeah, that's what I want. Okay, so let's look at. I've got some test data in here, but so just looking at some of the stuff that's coming in with the Captivate wrapper. Let's see, can we find? Let's blow this up and see if we can find xAPI dude in here. So there he is. So this is a brand new profile. I've never used xAPI dude before, so I've accessed the course one time. You can see nothing else. I haven't gotten into any videos yet. I haven't started any quizzes. I haven't done any of that stuff, and I haven't completed the course. So there's really very little information so far on xAPI dude, but you can look at some of these other profiles where I've gone through and really spent some time on it. You can see that they accessed it, how much time they spent focused on the learning or unfocused on the learning, and basically that's any time that you navigate away from the learning. So if you open up your email, you've got a video playing and you swipe over to a different desktop and you decide to do something else where that video is playing in the background. That's, I know a lot of people consume learning that way, and that's interesting to know. Is my video boring? Were they too pressed for time when I released this, and that's why they're trying to multitask and not pay attention to what I'm doing? So it really can give you an idea if your learners are staying focused on the content that they're consuming or if they're wandering off. If they are wandering off, you may want to know a little bit more about that. So I created this duration of view time on slide reports. Give Watershed just a minute to catch up. Okay, so here you can see now, rather than looking at the user, I'm looking at the slides in general. So what's the average time that the users are spending on any one of these slides? How many times have they entered that slide? And then when they were on that slide, how much of the time that, if we're saying that they were on it for 39 seconds, how much of that time was on focus time? So for 2 seconds, they navigated away and they came back. But again, looking for trends here, seeing is there always a slide someone's unfocusing on, and why? There must be something boring in my course that they're deciding to do something else. Maybe I need to redesign that slide or rethink that slide. So we've taken a look at some of the statements. We've taken a look at the dashboard. So I'm going to go back to the Verb demo now, and let's take a look at videos and what they do. So I'm going to open this up, and I have 3 different videos that I embedded inside of here. So this first video I'm going to play, and I'm going to pause, and I'll play again, and I'll pause. And let's scrub this guy up a little bit. And then let's do the same thing over here. We'll just let this one play. Maybe here I'm going to mute and unmute and pause. So what does this look like coming into the LRS? So switching back again. So first let's look at the raw statements. So here you can see my xAPI dude paused, unmuted, muted. And you might want to know, where did they mute it? Maybe your videos are too loud. So one of the things muted passes in is right here. I was 25 seconds in when we muted, right? So that's into the video when we muted that video. So you can see, is there a certain point where they're adjusting the volume or muting out or doing those sorts of things? Or do they always hit mute? Should closed caption be something that we're using because the default behavior of the user is muting it out? You'll be able to learn that through what it's reporting here. Also the same thing for, I'm not seeing my scrub statement here. Let me see if it didn't. May have found a bug. I was working last time. Well, I know I've got some past scrub statements in there, so I'll just find one real quick. And I did use the video profiles for these as best as I could figure out how to do, so if you're interested in that. Okay, so here's an old instance. Maybe I've got the scrub verb turned off. There's a couple of things we can look at. But if I drop this down, again, scrub, it's kind of similar. It's a video object, but there's a couple of things you need to know about scrub. And the things that you need to know are down here. When did you start the scrub? Where did you scrub to? And then what's the difference? So you can see that's an extension. Here's my ending point of the scrub. And somewhere in here, it doesn't put it in order, is the starting time. Here at 9 seconds I started scrubbing. I ended at 11 seconds. So I scrubbed forward 2 seconds, and that's rounded. And here it's actually rounded up. So 3 seconds is what it would actually report. So we can pull this back out now and say, hey, we're always scrubbing this many seconds at this point, and start to look for trends. And just to show you how you might put that into application, so again, building a dashboard here for that. And again, I don't have this 100% figured out. It's still a little bit, a little wonky. But when you take a look at how we scrub, the red represents back scrub and blue represents forward scrub. So are people rewinding in videos and rewatching a certain part? Maybe that's a really hard concept, and we should put additional resources behind that, or explain it a different way, or make sure we're testing to that. Or the blue line, are they scrubbing over that? And if they're scrubbing over that section all the time, maybe they're just trying to get to the end of the video so that they can proceed, if that's the way you've got it set up. So I think you can really find some interesting data. Now, the reason that I say this isn't quite perfected yet is it's aggregating everything. So this add, init, and variables video, I've had a total scrub time forward of 8 minutes and 4 seconds. And so that's not the individual one. There's a few things I need to tweak on this card so we can see individual users. But like you'll notice this published video and you're like, boy, that's a lot of back scrubbing. That's because when I was figuring out the logic for this, I back scrubbed and back scrubbed and back scrubbed 2 minutes at a time each time. So now there's all these instances of that happening in here from when I was testing it. But you can see how very quickly we can aggregate that and look at the bottom. So we've got an average time of scrubbing 11 minutes backwards. So that's probably a good thing. Users are reviewing our content, but we can kind of quickly pull some of that information out of there. All right, and then the final thing that's a huge part of any of this is the quizzing. And I have to say this was a whole new world for me because we actually have our own solution for quizzing. We don't use Captivate for quizzing, and we're starting to now because I've gotten so familiar with it when building this. But quizzing is a big part of any learning. So I just put in a couple of different questions here that hopefully we can all get. So which of these is not part of an xAPI statement? And we know adjective is not. An LRS both host content and receive statements. That's really false because it really only receives statements, and LMS is what does that. And let's go ahead and get the next one wrong. So arrange the order, I got a typo, arrange the order and these reporting methods were introduced. So the first was, let's say, we'll leave it in this order. So xAPI was not first, right? It was SCORM 1.2, then SCORM 2004, and xAPI last. So this one we're going to purposely get wrong. And then it takes me off, and for this particular quiz, I had the benchmark set pretty high in order to pass the quiz, so because we got one wrong, we failed the quiz. And we'll go ahead and we'll review the quiz as, okay, well, which one did I get wrong? And it wasn't that one, yet that made sense, but here, oh, all of these are in the wrong order, so now I've reviewed it as well. Going back to the LRS, what did we get out of that? So here you can see the reviewed, where we went through, and you can see how much time are they spending on each slide when they reviewed it. Did they take the time to review it, or did they just, yeah, I want to move on and I don't really care about that? Because we reached the last slide, you can see that we sent the verb completed course. So that was the criteria that I have set for, is if you just reached the last slide, it's going to send, I've made it all the way through, I have completed the course. Also, the quiz, you can see, has its own set of information here. So I finished the Super Rapper cohort demo quiz. Let's look at some of the information inside of that. So when I come down and take a look at this statement, remember I got 77 point whatever %. So here that is scaled in the result. I can see that I got 78%. The total max score, because not all of your Captivate questions have to have the same point value. So one of them I think I assigned 5.2, another one I assigned 20.2. So that one I missed must have been a 10-point question because the raw score was 35 and my max score is 45. And because I didn't do that, we're good. We can also see now in this statement, this is rolling up the whole quiz. It took me 53 seconds to go through that entire quiz. So if you want to know that sort of stuff, you can. Let me back up. Oh, let's talk a little bit about context. So you'll notice now we've got a quiz, and the quiz's parent is the overall project. But that was for just this quiz. Let's go one step further and let's look at one of these statements, correctly answered, and let's look how that changes. Now you'll notice you actually have two different parents in here. The main parent is the cohort demo, but this question belongs to the quiz. So now I can say, I want, I can search by two different parameters. I want all related activities to this course, but only the ones that have this quiz as the parent. Now I'm only going to get the information back about the quiz rather than getting information back about the whole course. So it's another great way where the LRS, you can go in and create reports very quickly on the data that you want. Now let's take a little look at how that spits out in reports. So at a glance, this is one that we've started putting together just when we put out learning, and it's just a super easy visual that will show me the correct responses versus the incorrect responses. So if I put out some learning, I think it's good, and all of a sudden I see that answered incorrectly is beating answered correctly. Well, maybe my learning's bad, maybe my questions are bad. I can make some pretty quick insights right away. And then I can go down and actually look at each one of those different activities because the question is the activity and see, well, is it a specific one that they're getting wrong or is it pretty evenly spread? And in this case, it's pretty evenly spread. I've answered them incorrectly almost as much as I've answered them correctly, or in the second case, dead on even. So it's a way that we can quickly evaluate where our learners are at by just glancing at something. Now, of course, a lot of times we want to dig a little bit deeper, or maybe you want to look at individual users. Pull this guy open. So this one was kind of a surprise to me. CMI5 is the profile that I used for all of the questions, and I didn't really realize the power of that until I ran this report in Watershed. Like I said, we never really used this for quizzing. It was amazing to me. All I did was opened up this report and populated the parent ID, and all of a sudden I've got every user that ever took their course, their completions, their registrations, their best score, their last score. All of that stuff happened just by telling Watershed this is the ID that I'm looking at. I didn't have to build any of that. And the data just goes on and on and on. You can see all scores, what ranges did they fall in. You can sort it by last score, best score, first score. So if they had to take it a number of times until they reached a certain percentage, what did that look like? What did it look like the first time they took it versus the last time that they took it? What is the average score of my users that are taking it? What's the best score? What's the last score? All of this stuff, like I said, just Watershed does automatically by using that CMI5 profile. All right, so let's now, I think I went through all of these. Here's another, backing up to video again, I didn't show this card, but once you actually have those videos embedded, here's some information, how many times did your user pause it, how many times did they scrub it, what videos did they play. All of that sort of stuff, it can be aggregated here in this report. And again, all of these reports I put together in literally 45 minutes. I didn't really spend a lot of time digging in too deep, but I did want to show the practical uses of how this spits out on the backside when you're using an LRS. So let's talk about how this works and what actually powers this. And okay, I'm a Captivate user. Tell me more. How do I move on to the next steps? Well, one of the things that I've done since the last demo is I really built out the Github Readme on what's going on here. Before it was just a quick little, here's how you do it, and I didn't really have too much other explanation. I spent a lot of time going through, so if you're wondering things like how is it getting the parent activity, how is it doing some of these different things, you can dive into the logic that I use. So let's say, I'll just navigate to a couple different places, show you what I'm talking about. So like the overview, if you click on that. So what is it? It's basically the same description that Megan put out for what my demo is going to be on. I took it straight out of this overview, and it just talks about what the package is, pretty much everything we've talked about for the last 20 minutes. But remember I talked about actor, and well, how does this get the actor? Well, first of all, the actor is, tell you who it is. It's the person taking the course, and this can populate one of three ways with SuperWrapper, either through SCORM, through that mailbox parameter, or from a SuperWrapper override, where you basically are manually setting, like if you knew this course was only going to go to one person, you didn't want to pass it, you could just override it and put hard code it into the code and make it work that way. So kind of all throughout here you'll find that. That's another good example. If you're curious of what verbs I've used and where, so for navigation events, here's the verbs that we're using. For video events, here's the verbs we're using. For quiz events, here's the verbs we're using. Now, where does that line up and why does that matter to you? Well, maybe you've got a completely different vernacular at your company, and like I said, I just learned about the SCORM profile and some of those things, so I'm going to update this to make sure those match that profile. But let's say you didn't know about profiles either, and you've already implemented something at your place of work, and you have a profile that's kind of unique to your environment, and you need to match up those verbs. So let's look at what's actually powering this. This is the wrapper itself. This is the controller. This is one of the pieces that you're embedding into Captivate. And just to kind of show you what that looks like, a Captivate publish package. Let me go here. So this is a Captivate publish package. I'll kind of roll everything up. So any of you that use Captivate should be fairly familiar with this. You publish it in HTML5. This is what you see on the backside when it spits out. So all we really have to do to install SuperWrapper is this index.html. If you double click on it, it's going to open up. But if you open it up with a code editor, I have this same index right here. So in order to make SuperWrapper work, all I'm really doing is loading two more files from the index. So this controller version and tin can. We need the tin can helper library. That's what that is. And then this controller that we've written for this. And then the only other place that you've got to plug in a little bit of code is where it's actually loading this. This line right here is the only other, nope, that's not it. There should be a push, here it is. This line right here is the only other line that we're adding, and all it's really saying is these are the files that Captivate's loading, jQuery and CPM. That comes out of the box, and now I'm just saying to this array, push two more files, this tin can and controller version, which are the files that are referenced up here. So you drop in these couple lines of code in your package, and then the only other thing that you need to do is going back to that in Finder is in assets.js, and actually mine's loading from a different spot. But normally you would see that controller. Actually, I can back up here, see if I can find the regular cohort demo. Here, if I get into this folder, it'll have it. So the only other thing I had to do was copy and paste this tin can and controller file in. So about 3 minutes worth of setup, little cut and paste here and there, a little drag and drop, and now this package is ready to go, and it'll kind of take over and do the rest. From there, some of the other things that you can do with this is we talked about custom verb profiles. So for instance, I demoed this last time around. Let's say that instead of accessed, I want to use, for whatever reason, in my company, we don't use accessed, we use a nonsense word. And the nonsense word I like to use is wumbo, because wumbo is a SpongeBob reference, and me and my daughter have been watching that for years. So I'm just going to, all I'm doing is I'm changing the activity ID to wumbo, and this is the display. So whatever we put in here is what it's going to display. Whatever we put in here is going to be the verb that it's using. So now I can save this. And let's go back to my demo. Chrome. Here we go. Okay, so now I'm just going to refresh this demo so that we're restarting the project again. It didn't ask me for my username because it's still appended there with mbox because all we did was a refresh. But now let's go into the LRS. And if I go to data search, you can see now instead of accessing the course, I wumboed the course. So just that easily, you can change any of these statements to your own profile and your own statement of how you want to use it. The other thing, go back to the code here. The other thing is you can turn all of these values on and off. Like I was kind of surprised I didn't see this in the LRS because I wanted to demo it, and I see why now. I must have been working on this since my last demo. And I set focus and unfocus to false. So because they're set to false, you're never going to get those statements. And maybe, for your learning, you're sending the users off to the web or to go look at something, so they're going to unfocus from the learning. So you don't really care. That's the point of it all, so you don't want to use it. So you just set that to false. But let's turn that back on again. And now, if I set that to true, now let's go back to the learning, restart it. Okay, so I just wumboed it again, and now I'm going to unfocus, refocus, unfocus, mess around, do this. Now let's go into watershed, and when I hit refresh, you can see, probably not keeping up with me, there's all my unfocused and focused statements. And if you look in there, it'll tell you the time you unfocused and how long when you came back, when you refocused, or when xAPI dude focused on the mission, you can look and see how many seconds I was gone. And you can aggregate that data and see how long you were unfocused for. So all of those parameters are customizable along with a bunch of other stuff. So let's talk a little bit more about, I said we were pulling some values straight out of Captivate. So you remember the one slide that I mentioned? This is the Captivate itself behind it. But remember the first slide I showed, I said our activity was navigation verb explanation. It's just pulling that from these properties right here. The entire project, the name of the project, is actually in preferences. So if you go into preferences in Captivate and you go to project information, you're able to put in your project name. That becomes the parent for our xAPI project, and it also pulls description too. So if you want to put in a description, it's going to put both the name and the description inside of your definition for that particular activity. So like I said, really the thought behind this was just create like you always have. You really don't have to do anything different, and Captivate will respond to that. The only other piece of setup that you have to do, it's pretty straightforward. I think I'm almost close to a workaround, so you won't even have to do this, is on the first slide on Captivate, if you select the slide itself, there's these actions over here. So it's saying on enter, as soon as you open up this slide, is there anything you want me to do? And usually the default is no action. Well, I changed that to execute JavaScript, and all I want you to do is call the function init. And that's what it's doing. So init is a function inside of that controller that I have. It's starting the whole Captivate, or the whole controller to make everything happen. Like I said, I think I'll be able to avoid that in the future, but just set up your Captivate as you always have, put in that init function, and the rest sort of happens itself. Now the other thing is, okay, how do I hook up to my LRS? And that's one of the things with Captivate that kind of frustrated me. They have tin can support. I'm a pretty tech-savvy guy, as hopefully I'm demonstrating today. I could not for the life of me get it to work. I read every blog. I did everything there was. And that's kind of what brought me to this point today, was I couldn't figure out how to get my LRS information in there with a TC config file, but it just never worked. So to make that much easier for you, the user, all you have to do is go into project and variables. And you set up right here your endpoint. So if I click on that, it'll show the value. So here's my endpoint, my key, and my secret. I just put those in as variable values, and that's what it's looking for now. And I actually have it set up so you can put in sandbox credentials too. So if you want to toggle between two different environments, I want to test it in sandbox, and then when it's all good to go, I'm ready to move it to my production LRS. You can put in both values when you create the package, and then to toggle that, all you have to do is go back into this controller again. Go back into this controller, and once you get past the verbs, there's some other settings here. And one of those is, first of all, do we want to report to the LRS? I mean, maybe we're just testing and we don't want to create 1,000 bogus statements while we're testing. So you can set that to false, and then it'll stop reporting to the LRS. Right now, I've got it set to production as true, so that's the keys that it's using. If I want to, I could set this to false, and then that would be the keys that I'm using. Let's say I've got all these Captivate packages that I want to add this to, and I don't want to have to add those variables 1,000 times. You can also manually add them here. You can put in your key and endpoint. It'll look for this value first. If it exists, it'll use that. If it doesn't exist, it'll default to looking for the Captivate variable that's set up with that. If neither of those exist, it'll kick back and say can't set up the LRS. We haven't passed in the credentials. The other thing that is kind of some of the other properties, like I showed you where it pulled that parent name from out of Captivate. But again, let's say you wanted to manually set that up yourself. You didn't necessarily want to pull it out of Captivate. I duplicated a lot of those parameters. If they're set to null, they're going to pull it from Captivate. But you can change it to anything that you want to depending on what you're doing. Like the base ID is what everything is being used for in my statements. Let me go back. I'll show you what I'm talking about there. Chrome. Okay, so if we take a look at this, and you look at the base for all of this, it's this brianfloyd.me/superwrapper. Well, where is it pulling it from? Again, if you don't pass it a base ID, it's going to pull it from here, right? So if this was the page we were on, it's going to take it from that URL. Where that can get really messy is, have you ever seen a SCORM URL? They are 1,000 miles long, and now all of a sudden you've just got all this junk in your statement that you really don't need, and your IDs become really complicated. So you may want to avoid that, and in order to avoid that, you would just come in here and set what you want your parent's ID to be. You can set it to any value you want, and then it'll just append the rest onto the end of that. So lots of different functionality there and being able to set all of those different properties kind of the way that you want to. But I know to some people this is still very codey. I mean, there's a lot to look at here, and it seems really straightforward to me. But I remember the first time I looked at this stuff, I'm like, I just don't understand. There's a whole bunch of words and brackets, and I don't even know what's going on here, right? So if you feel like you're in that boat, the next step of this project, once it's well vetted and I'm sure that all the bugs are mainly worked out of it, I've been working on an Electron app. And that Electron app will allow you to, at some point, just take your Captivate publish package, and you'll just be able to say, I choose this file, put in my zip package, it'll drop it in there. And then from there, I'll be able to go into the super wrapper parameters and manually set, I'm not sure why that's not working. Let me try something real quick. If I can't get it to work, I won't belabor the process, but let me see what I can do here. Just restart it real quick and see if that fixes it. Well, I must have broke something when I was playing around. What it should be taking me to, and then the first demo I was able to demo it, is just checkboxes. So you can turn off the verbs using checkboxes. You can change the verb display name. You can change the verb ID, and it's just filling out a form and fields. And then that will generate that parameters object that it's ultimately going to use. So even if you don't have the codey ability to go in and do all of those things, you're able to do so. Going back one more time to the documentation, just again, if you want to get started, how do I get started today? Let's see, that's Safari. I ain't got too many windows going on here, my apologies. Okay, so back to the repository again. So if you go in here to setup, first of all, I created a YouTube that's a step-by-step walkthrough. So if you're not understanding what what I put in through here, you can watch it on video. But it's the same things that I just talked about. So step one, here's your screenshot. We're going to open that script window. We're going to put in an it. Done. Next thing we need to do is we need to set up these variables, depending whether you want to use production or sandbox. And you just set up to your LRS credentials that you pulled out of SCORM Cloud or Watershed or the LRS of your choosing. And again, I just showed what that looks like in the variable setting. So if you're not sure where to go, it's this variable creator that that we all use. Step 3 is it just talks about some of the different things like making sure that project information is filled in so that it has a parent name, making sure that you only publish in HTML. We don't support Flash. SCORM or no SCORM is okay. So, you know, if you publish as a SCORM course, that's fine. You can still add this to it, but you're going to be modifying a different index file than you would for a normal package. So some of that changes. These are the 3 files. I actually have a 3rd file that I didn't show that if you're using Internet Explorer that basically says, sorry, we can't use Internet Explorer, but I didn't include that in my demo here. And then this shows you which, you know, how to add those script tags that we talked, or that little bit of code that we needed to add. So we're adding this in the beginning of that index file that's published. So that, and then this next thing, this LJS files, finding that and then putting in this push statement to push the next 2 files to it, and that's it. You're good to go. Now upload it to your LRS or LMS, or host it on a server, or do whatever it is that you want to do. The other thing is this is very much a work in progress. So as I've progressed and made new functionality, new features, come up with different ways to do things, I continue to update the bottom of this README. So if you kind of want to see what the latest, greatest is, or what I'm working on, that's a good place to do it. The other thing I would love for folks to use, especially if you really start testing this thing, and I would love to get some usage on it. I actually have a guy right now in Norway that's using it. It's pretty cool. All the statements are coming back in Norwegian, which is a whole new experience to me. But if you open up this issues here, you can see I've created all of these. But I've got no support in there for the Adobe Captivate table of contents. And I know a lot of courses are driven around that. You may want to know how your users are interacting with that. Another one that I've almost got working, but there's just a little glitch with the xAPI that's throwing me off, but I'll figure it out, is offline statements. So if you do all of this stuff offline, it saves it to local storage. It listens for the next time that you're back online again, and will batch send all of those statements with the appropriate timestamp for when you were offline. So we should even be able to capture offline learning before too long. And then there are a couple of bugs. Like right now, something is the matter with my CMI5 for matching. It keeps kicking it out of the LRS and saying there's an error. That one's been befuddling me, but again, I will figure it out. But you know, anybody can go into GitHub and add enhancement requests, issue requests. I mean, if you're a coder and you want to play around with this, by all means, please fork it, make it your own, do whatever you need to do with it to have some fun with it. And check it out. And I love talking about this stuff, so feel free to reach out to me, ask me any questions you have. It's been kind of a passion project of mine and something I want to continue. So I think that pretty much takes my time, right?
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
You have about 2 minutes. I did see that Chris had written in the chat a little bit earlier. He was curious about what tool you were using for quizzes before you discovered the xAPI method.
I coded my own version, and it's just a JavaScript code that I've got a quiz maker. We quickly create the quizzes, and then it just generates a link, and we attach that link to whoever we want to quiz. Is what we were using in the past.
There are also some comments just about the amazing documentation that you've been doing, and people are really into everything that you've been doing, and they're learning a lot. So.
Excellent. Yeah, and if there's better ways, I mean, I'm not open to, or I'm completely open to, you know, if I didn't think about something right or it's not working for your use case. I mean, I built this around our use case because it's the only use case that I know, but I would love for folks to say, well, this is my use case and here's why it's not working, or here's where something seems a little bit weird. And there's certainly going to be things like that, but I would love to give this some exposure and get it out to the community.
All right. Any last questions from those of you who are online? Chris is typing something. No questions. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for sharing what you've been working on. And that wraps up this session. So the next one will begin at 2:45.
Thanks, everyone.